Aladyr del día de hoy. Estamos muy agradecidos con todos los que nos acompañan en este momento. Sabemos que la mayoría está haciendo home office y que sacar un poquito de tiempo para este tipo de actividades e iniciativas no resulta del todo fácil, así que muchísimas gracias. Mi nombre es Rahil Macarén, para los que no me conocen, soy la directora de Mercadeo y Comunicación de Aladyr. No comparto mi pantalla para evitar que al tener varias pantallas compartidas, algunos tengan problemas con la conexión o con escuchar de manera correcta la presentación, así que por los momentos solo me escucharán. Nos acompaña el señor Bahman Sheik, quien es nuestro presentador del día de hoy. Antes de dar inicio a nuestra sesión, quiero informarles que todos están con los micrófonos en silencio o en mute, con la intención de evitar ruidos molestos o algún tipo de molestia dentro del transcurso de la presentación. Sin embargo, todos van a tener la oportunidad de hacer sus preguntas o interrogantes al finalizar la presentación. Si pueden ver, en el menú inferior de su computador hay una sección donde dice Q&A o preguntas y respuestas. Allí, al darle clic, pueden escribir sin ningún problema sus dudas o inquietudes, e incluso si tienen algún problema y no escuchan bien o cualquier otra interferencia, también nos pueden escribir por allí para a la brevedad tratar de solventarles esta situación. Bueno, voy a hacer una breve presentación del señor Sheik y después vamos a hacerles dos preguntitas antes de comenzar nuestro webinar. El señor Bahman Sheik tiene más de 30 años de experiencia local e internacional en investigación, planificación y diseño de proyectos de recursos hídricos, especializándose en conservación, recuperación, reuso y reciclaje de agua. El Dr. Sheik inició su carrera académica como profesor universitario y continuó con consultorías, investigaciones técnicas, planificación maestra y diseño de equipamientos para recursos hídricos. Su experiencia en reciclaje de agua incluye el sector público y privado. Él elaboró las metas de reuso de agua para la ciudad de Los Ángeles y planificó los proyectos de reciclaje de agua para el 2090 con gran alcance público. El enfoque de muchos de los trabajos del Dr. Sheik es en salud pública y seguridad del agua reciclada para el riego, industrias y uso potable. Gran parte del trabajo realizado por el Dr. Sheik está localizado en California, Colorado y Hawái. Adicionalmente, ha trabajado en proyectos de reuso de agua con clientes en 21 países que incluyen Perú, Bonaire, México, Corea del Sur, Australia, Arabia Saudita, Egipto, India, Jordania, Kuwait, Emiratos Árabes, Siria, Bahrein, Marruecos y Tunisia. Antes de continuar, quiero recordarles que a pesar de que la presentación es en inglés, si alguno tiene alguna dificultad tal vez en la escritura para el tema de las preguntas, las puede hacer tanto en español como en inglés, porque vamos a contar con una persona que nos va a apoyar en la traducción, con el señor Bahman. Así que si tienen alguna pregunta al finalizar, sin problema la pueden hacer en inglés o en español, puesto que tendremos soporte para poder responder de manera eficiente. Entonces, antes de iniciar, vamos a hacerle unas breves preguntas, por favor. Solo deben marcar la opción que consideren. Vamos a dar unos 20 segundos para que marquen y pasamos a la segunda pregunta. ¿Cree usted que el reuso de agua es una solución viable para el riego agrícola? La segunda pregunta, por favor.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. This is a pleasure for me to be presenting to you my experience about use of recycled water in agriculture.
One moment, Mr. Bahman, please.
Yes.
Sorry.
Okay. Let me know when to start.
Yes, no problem. ¿Cuál cree usted que es el mayor reto de implementar el reuso de agua para el riego en la agricultura? ¿Regulatorio, cultural, costos, tecnológico? Listo.
Okay.
Ahora, en este momento, vamos a invitar formalmente al señor Bahman para continuar con la presentación. Please continue, Mr. Bahman. It's your turn.
Thank you. Thank you very much. As I said, it's a pleasure to present to you today. The outline of our presentation is talking about agricultural use of recycled reclaimed water, regulations for water reuse that protect the public, some of the research results that we have to date, making sure that you know about the safety of water reuse in agriculture, and also the record that we have established so far by using recycled water in agriculture. As you probably know, today, April 22nd, is the 50th year that we are celebrating Earth Day, the environment and its sustainability for the future of our children and our grandchildren. So basically, happy Earth Day. And I think recycled water is a environmentally important use of water, and so it's fitting that today we're talking about this. The world, much of the world that is occupied and populated is actually under water stress. As you see this map of the world, the darker areas, the darker the area, a country or a region is, the more water stress there is. In other words, less water availability per person for beneficial uses. And the world population is expected to increase. And right now it's around 9-10 billion people, and it's expected to go up to at least 12 billion by the year 2100, and maybe even more if we don't do anything about it. So the need for water is going to increase tremendously. Recycled water for agriculture is used in many, many countries, but some of the more prominent places where I've seen uses of recycled water in various ways are listed here below. Mexico, for example, uses nearly all of the wastewater that's generated in Mexico City is transported up to Mezquital Valley to the north of Mexico City and utilized for agricultural purposes. In the United States, California, Florida, Arizona, Texas, and a few other states are prominent in use of recycled water to various degrees. South Africa is a pioneer in water reuse. So is Australia. Australia went through 11 years of drought, the millennial drought during the early 2000s. And for 11 years, they ramped up their water recycling projects and produced these specific projects, the Mackay, the Wirribee, Virginia Pipeline Scheme. And these are huge water recycling projects that have been in operation ever since then and have been quite successful. Spain and other southern European countries are also big on water recycling. Egypt has a huge water recycling area near Cairo called Gabal al-Asfar. Tunisia and Morocco have got water reuse projects. Israel is a pioneer in water reuse, and from the 1960s on, they have developed water reuse projects so that by now they use over 94% of their wastewater and convert it to very high quality water that's used in Negev deserts to grow agricultural crops of all kinds. Jordan, in the Jordan Valley near Dead Sea, uses recycled water almost entirely for agriculture. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and United Arab Emirates are also big users of recycled water, and they treat it to a fairly high degree. So there are some examples of where this is used. Farmers, when they were first presented in California with the idea of using recycled water, they were skeptical. They were not sure that this was a good idea. And their skepticism was based on 4 S's. First of all, the sales. They were worried that the public perception would dampen their sales, and people would not be willing to buy produce that was grown with recycled water. This was a perception problem. They also were worried that their soils would be affected by salt, and the permeability of the soil would be reduced because of the sodium content of the recycled water. And this is the subject of much study because it truly can affect soil permeability unless irrigation management practices are adapted to counter the effect of salts and particularly sodium. Safety, they were worried about the safety of their consumers and about the safety of their workers that would be impacted by contact with recycled water that they thought might contain pathogenic organisms, even though we have proven that we can remove the pathogenic organisms and the safety issue has been resolved. Finally, they were also concerned about the reliability of the water supply. Will it always be available? If we start depending on it and suddenly the treatment plant goes down, what happens to the reliability of the supply? So these were their concerns. And in the next hour, I hope to be able to establish that these concerns, particularly the safety concerns, have been well taken care of by research and by the experience that we have gained over the past 20-some years with use of recycled water in the United States and other countries. Regulations for water reuse for agriculture are very important in assuring safety. And these regulations are primarily those of the World Health Organization. The World Health Organization has got guidelines for water reuse, and these have been adopted by many countries, particularly in Europe. And they involve several ways of reducing the pathogens that are in the water. As you know, the raw material of recycled water is sewage, which is full of pathogenic organisms. So some of the ways of reducing the pathogens are treatment, the method of irrigation, mechanical operations versus manual operations, time to harvest, from the time to harvest until it gets to the public. And so those are ways that WHO deals with regulating or guiding safe use of recycled water. California has what they call Title 22. It's a part of the regulations of the state that deals with safe use of recycled water. And it has got 4 levels of treatment that are allowed for use for agriculture. And I'll explain those 4 levels of treatment in a few minutes. And the highest level of treatment among these 4 levels allows 43 specifically identified uses, half of which have to do with agriculture. Food crops can be irrigated with disinfected tertiary recycled water. Disinfected tertiary recycled water is a specific level of treatment that is the highest for non-potable uses that's allowed in California. Those 43 uses, some of them are listed in this chart. As you see, there are 4 columns next to each recycled water use. And irrigation for a variety of uses, from food crops to school grounds to parks, golf courses, cemeteries, freeway landscaping, etc., and so forth, are all listed on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, there are 4 columns for 4 different levels of treatment. With disinfected tertiary recycled water, as you see, it's all green for all uses, all 43 uses, including all uses are agricultural. When you go to lower levels of treatment, such as disinfected secondary or undisinfected secondary, then limitations are imposed on certain types of use that cannot be applied. For example, food crops cannot be grown with anything less than disinfected tertiary. Let's go back to WHO, World Health Organization guidelines. Though, as I said, World Health Organization guidelines deal with treatment, die-off, washing of produce, method of irrigation, and each of these is capable of reducing the pathogenic content of the sewage by a certain amount. On the left-hand side of the scale is the log 10 pathogen reduction, from 0 to 7 logs reduction. And 7 log reduction, of course, means 10 to the power 7. And that's a tremendous amount of reduction. 4 logs in the first column, for example, column A, if you're growing root crops, you can reduce 4 logs of the virus, of pathogens with treatment, another 2 logs with die off as a result of staying under the sun before harvest, and another log of reduction with washing of the produce after it comes off the crop. So overall, you get 7 logs of reduction for root crops. Then you go to leaf crops, similarly with 3 different levels of pathogen reduction. We get to 6 logs reduction, which is plenty adequate. Anything more than 5 logs reduction basically means that 99.999% of pathogenic organisms have been gotten rid of. And on the right-hand side of the scale, we see with restricted irrigation, you even need less treatment. You can obtain most of your reduction in pathogenic levels with other than treatment methods. For example, the last column has SSI, subsurface irrigation. With subsurface irrigation and with a little treatment, like primary treatment, you can achieve 7 logs of reduction of pathogenic organisms, and the produce that's grown with subsurface irrigation is safe to consume. So these guidelines are very important, and that's why they've been adopted by many European countries and probably by many of the Latin American countries. I'm not aware of those regulations as much as I am with European and American regulations. Let's look at the international standards and regulations. As I mentioned, World Health Organization is the primary one, US, and in each individual state, there is a different set of regulations and guidelines. The United States does not have a national overall regulation for water reuse. Each state is free to implement their own regulations, and they do. European countries have got separate regulations. Japan has got separate regulations. So does Australia and South Africa, and in the Middle East and North Africa. And I have a compendium of all of these regulations, and they're all comparable. Basically, they say the same thing. The level of treatment is essentially the same. The level of avoidance of contact with pathogenic organisms is essentially the same, but they've got different ways of expressing them. And I'll go into some detail of these because those of you who are interested in safety of recycled water need to know how we reach that level of safety in each country. Microbial indicators of pathogen kill are different in different places. How do we indicate that we have achieved enough kill of pathogens to be safe? Most countries have adopted either total fecal coliforms or Escherichia coli as indicators of pathogenic organisms that have been deactivated or killed. These are all equivalent indicators of presence or absence of pathogens, and also their numeration of how many have been left after treatment. And they've been accepted and used worldwide. Europeans use basically E. coli, as does Australia and the World Health Organization. There's a wide range of numerical standards in different countries and jurisdictions. But as I said, they all aim at the same thing, adequate safety for consumers and for workers, even though the numbers may vary quite a bit. The choice of indicator is based on historical practice, level of comfort, and habit. If you're used to using E. coli, Escherichia coli, as an indicator, that is what's used in a place, even though some other country like California, for example, might insist on total coliform as an indicator. Let's look at disinfection for unrestricted irrigation. What do you mean by unrestricted irrigation? That's where every crop, any crop is allowed. And vegetable crops that are eaten raw are the most sensitive. They're the ones that are in most intimate contact between the water that's used for irrigation and the edible part of the plant that is sold in the market for consumption. So that being the most sensitive, let's look at the regulations that govern use of recycled water for that purpose. Colorado, New Mexico, Texas prohibit use of recycled water, even at any level of treatment. They're very protective in that regard. Italy insists on less than 2 coliform per 100 ml, total coliform. The US EPA recommends no detect, basically 0 fecal coliform per 100 milliliters. California and Washington have less than 2.2 coliform per 100 ml, total coliform per 100 ml. And we feel comfortable with that level of treatment, and we have many years of experience to show that that is good enough. Now we go down to Germany, Victoria, Australia. We get to more permissive levels of treatment. For example, less than 10 fecal coliform. Spain, less than 200. France, Sicily, Greece, Mexico, Mediterranean region, less than 1,000 fecal coliform per 100 ml. Now, are these higher levels less safe? Well, I have not seen a study that shows the equivalency of these numbers in terms of safety, but basically the places where they allow these levels of treatment are okay with it, and apparently their experience indicates that it's safe enough. But in California, we want 3 orders of magnitude better or lower levels of coliform detected in the final effluent that's allowed to be used for irrigation. So as you see, there's a wide variation in that particular regard. Now let's go back to disinfection for irrigation of processed food, orchards and pastures. In this case, as you see, there's also a wide variation, but this is not as critical as vegetable crops that are eaten raw. Let's look at disinfection for irrigation of urban parks, cemeteries, playgrounds, athletic fields. Again, this is less restrictive than food crops that are eaten raw, but California still insists on less than 2.2 for total coliform. Again, wide range of variation in regulatory requirements. Treatment for removal and inactivation of microbes is different for different things. For protozoans, filtration is what's needed to remove them because protozoans are relatively large and they are kept in the surface of the filtration media. Bacteria require filtration and disinfection in order to be removed because some of them are small enough to pass through the filter. Viruses are very, very small and they can pass through even very fine filtration. So we need coagulation, sedimentation, filtration, and disinfection. More treatment, more levels of treatment to achieve the levels of removal of viruses that make the water safe for reuse. For chemicals that could be left in the wastewater, heavy metals are removed in sludges. Basically, primary treatment is all that's needed to remove most of the heavy metals. Nutrients are removed with biological nutrient remover, but that's not needed for irrigation because nutrients are beneficial for irrigation of food crops. And so the removal is not so necessary. Microconstituents, these are chemicals that remain in the water in extremely small concentrations, and I'll refer to those in more detail later. But these microconstituents can be removed with reverse osmosis where needed. However, that's not necessary for irrigation of food crops because most of them are taken care of in the soil. In the upper levels of the soil, they are oxidized and decomposed, and they do not enter into the tissues of the plant tissues. Let's look at various disinfectants that are used for finally killing microorganisms. Chlorine is the most commonly used disinfectant, and it can be in the gaseous form, in the hypochlorite form, in chloramines, or chlorine dioxide. And each one of these has been used in drinking water application, in wastewater application, in water use applications quite successfully. However, chlorine is a dangerous chemical to handle, and many agencies have moved away from use of chlorine and are going to other uses such as disinfection with ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet light is cost competitive with chlorine, is safer to use and transport. There's no hazardous disinfection byproducts, because we know that chlorine can form byproducts with the organic compounds. It combines with them to form chloramines and other compounds that could be hazardous. It's also effective against parasites such as Cryptosporidium, Giardia, and many bacteria. However, if you use ultraviolet irradiation, it does not leave a residual in the water during transport and final use. So it may be necessary to add some chlorine in the transport through pipelines to the end user to maintain that disinfection level. Some agencies use UV plus chlorine, both ultraviolet and chlorine. This is a very strong disinfectant and reduces the formation of biological growth and slimes in pipelines and oxidizes organic matter to prevent odors. Another important disinfectant is ozone. Ozone is a powerful oxidant, and that's how it achieves its purpose of disinfection, by oxidizing the outer layer of microbes, viruses, and various other pathogens. It basically removes organic matter from the wastewater. It removes color and odors, and it oxidizes potentially toxic chemicals to non-hazardous substances, such as CO2 and water. However, ozone has got fairly high operational and maintenance costs, and as a result, it's not as widely used as chlorine and UV. Membranes can be thought of as disinfectants because membranes can remove microorganisms through the process of size exclusion. Most microbes, especially protozoans and bacteria, are large enough that they do not pass through microfilters, nanofilters, especially not through reverse osmosis filters. Microfiltration can effectively remove Cryptosporidium, Giardia, and many bacteria. Reverse osmosis can remove all pathogens from the water, including viruses. So it's a very, very strong disinfectant and can be credited with several logs of reduction of pathogens if it is used in a process. However, as you all know, reverse osmosis is not inexpensive. It requires tremendous capital investment, and it requires energy to pass water through the membranes that are very highly energy intensive. Coronavirus is a big concern today, and the California State Water Resources Control Board today declared that California's recycled water and treated wastewater is safe from COVID-19 virus. This is a conclusion that, based on the very stringent state standards that are there to protect the public health. And as I mentioned in the previous slides, virus removal with ozone, with chlorine, with UV, and if you're using membranes, is very effective. And coronavirus is a virus like all others, And even though it's very, very small, it can be deactivated with disinfectants. Let's turn to the subject of farmers and their attitudes toward use of recycled water. I have a story to tell. In the 1970s, there was a huge regional wastewater treatment scheme proposed in Monterrey County, California. And the farmers were given the choice of using recycled water instead of groundwater for agriculture. And the reason for that is that groundwater was being overdrafted, seawater was intruding into the groundwater aquifers and making their well waters too salty to use. So they were really stuck between a rock and a hard spot, as we say. And their choice was tough, but they were skeptical. And they were questioning this new idea of using recycled water. They were worried about their sales, they were worried about their salts in the soils and safety of consumers, as I mentioned before, and supply reliability. So were the public health officials. The public health officials also were concerned about responsibility to the public at large. After all, sewage is the raw material. Sewage is a very dangerous material, and they needed to balance the need of water with the need for conservation and use of another resource. Farmers and growers were concerned about health of consumers, safety of farm workers, public perception, and long-term impacts on soils. I've mentioned this at least 3 times so far because it's extremely important to allay the concerns of the farmers. They are very important in the decision-making process for switching from one water source to another, to a recycled water source. The importance of treatment and risk reduction cannot be overemphasized. I've got this graphic that plots risk versus treatment. Risk goes up on the vertical scale and treatment goes up on the horizontal scale, from primary to secondary to tertiary to advanced treatment. And for each use, the level of treatment that's required to reduce the risk to a reasonable near zero risk is different. For example, if you're irrigating orchards, you only need to go to disinfected secondary to reduce the risk to a level that's acceptable, that's low enough. If you are irrigating cemeteries, parks, schools, schoolyards, industrial cooling, irrigation of vegetables, then you need to go to disinfected tertiary treatment before that risk reduction is adequate. If you want to go even higher and use the water for drinking, potable reuse, then you need to go all the way out to reverse osmosis and advanced oxidation and produce a water that's as near to pure water, pure H2O as possible before that risk reduction is achieved. And California is now moving toward that level of treatment. They're planning to establish regulations by the year 2023 to allow use of recycled water that's treated to an extremely high level for drinking water purposes in this state. I think this is a pattern, this is a trend that is going to be worldwide in dry regions of the world, because we cannot afford to get rid of the wastewater as the wasted water. We need to treat it to a higher level and use it. But our emphasis here is on agriculture, so we don't need to go that far. Disinfected tertiary, for all practical purposes, is good enough for almost all agricultural applications. We've done research into the safety of water reuse for agriculture in Monterrey County in the 1980s. We did the long-term field trials, over 5 years of field trials, and I happened to be the project manager for that project. In the 1990s, we did food safety tests, and in the 2000s, we've been concerned about compounds of emerging concern, these microconstituents in the water that remain in the recycled water. So all that research has been going on. The Water Research Foundation has also been very active in working on CECs that are in the water, constituents of emerging concern, and their significance to public health. I'll give you some data from from all these research projects that have been done in the past decade or so. In the Monterrey water recycling study for agriculture, we used randomized plots, randomized split plot design, and we grew lettuce, broccoli, cauliflower, celery, and artichokes over 5 years, side by side, irrigated with recycled water on some plots and irrigated with well water on other plots, and took thousands of samples for comparison and for testing. As I said, 5 years of field research and demonstration. We used 3 types of water, a secondary, advanced secondary, and a disinfected tertiary, and a well water for comparison. 4 fertilizer rates, 6 types of food crops, and 4 replications. And we grew these crops that you see that they mentioned, and 4 replicates. Overall, 96 random plots were used to do the experiments. We took thousands of samples from these plots. We used analysis of variance on the data. Analysis of variance is a very sensitive method, a statistical method of looking at data. It's designed for detection of minute differences that may occur there, and gives you 99% confidence level if the differences are due to the treatment or to natural variation. This is a aerial view of the 96 randomized split plots that were growing these plants over the 5-year period in these various plots irrigated with different water types. We did virus testing survival over a period of 2 weeks after irrigation, day by day, to see how much virus remains on the plant as a result of exposure to the air and to the sun and climatic variations. We found no virus in the recycled water itself, the tertiary, disinfected tertiary recycled water. So we used seeded virus. We actually seeded virus into the effluent to make sure that we could get 5-log reduction of the virus. We found that the crop quality was not affected. Yield was mostly unaffected. In fact, it increased in some cases. Worker safety, we did medical examinations of all the project personnel that came into contact with the water, from project manager on down to the irrigators and samplers. And every 6 months they would go to the doctor and be tested, and nothing that could be attributed to recycled water was found to be affecting any of them. Soil permeability was measured with double ring infiltrometers, as you see in this picture. And it was found not to be affected. Of course, the impact of sodium on soil permeability can be long-term, can be over 10, 20 years. So 5 years may not have been adequate for that purpose, but we are monitoring that. That project is still going on, on a large-scale basis, and they still have not seen any impact on soil permeability, so that's good news. Heavy metals were below detection limits at that time. Today, we have much better detection limits, and I'm sure we could find them, but they are definitely below levels that would be of any public health significance. We also looked into consumer acceptance issues by having a specialized firm interview buyers of produce, major buyers of produce that buy produce large scale wholesale for shipment across the country. And their view was that as long as the regulatory agencies were accepting of this use and they felt it was safe, that they would have no problem buying the produce. Field experience has been successful with recycled water in the California, in the Monterrey area since 1998. 5,000 hectares have been growing all these various vegetables, including strawberries, with no problems. In Watsonville, California, over 3,000 hectares since 2009. Santa Rosa, California since 1986. Orange County, Florida, 1,100 hectares since 1986. And these are experiences with which I'm quite familiar, and I can tell you there has been no difficulties or public safety problems, issues with use of recycled water. This is just a repeat of the fact that we have 5,000 hectares growing all these crops since 1998, a long time, 22 years now and going. This is a picture of Conserve 2, Orange County, Florida, using recycled water for growing citrus crops. Santa Rosa, California, wine grapes are irrigated with recycled water extensively in not only in Sonoma County, but also in Napa County, which produces some of the best wines that California exports worldwide.
Sorry, Mr.
Strawberries
Bahman.
growing in what?
Sorry, Mr. Bahman.
Yes,
Can
yes.
you share your camera, please? We have several journalists and they need to take photos. Thank you.
Okay, okay, we'll do that.
Thank
Good enough?
You. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, proof of safety of water reuse for agriculture comes in several ways. First of all, the record of experience with recycled water over more than 2 decades. Even though it's impossible to prove the negative, however, we have had no adverse public health outcomes over the past 2 decades and more. We've had no legal liability in contested cases. We have had increasing acreages of agricultural crops coming under recycled water use, and no backsliding. Nobody has started and then stopped using recycled water for any purposes. And we've been able to convert some of the skeptics to advocates. Below this line, I've got a hyperlink to a farmer who actually tells you in his own words, in his own field, how much he appreciates being able to use recycled water and not be dependent on an undependable groundwater supply. There was an E. coli 0157H7 epidemic, and there was a Spanish spinach recall in California about 10 years ago. And it was suspected at first that it may have come from recycled water. It was 2006, actually. And so many reporters came to interview the agency that produces recycled water, and they did an investigation, and there was no story. Basically, they found out that it came from pigs transferring livestock feces to spinach fields irrigated with well water, and was completely away from recycled water. So that was, so as a result of that, we did additional food safety studies in Monterrey, which I will tell you about now. The protocol for these studies was to sample the recycled water, sample the influent to the tertiary plant, sample the wastewater, and sample the well water as control. And we analyzed for Salmonella, Cyclospora, E. coli 0157H7, which is the deadly E. coli that can actually make people very sick. Sampled for Legionella, Giardia, Cryptosporidium, fecal coliform, turbidity, chlorine residual, and these are some of the results. For Salmonella, the raw wastewater had from non-detect to 16 CFU per 100 ml. The secondary effluent had 2.2 to 9.2. By the time we got to disinfected tertiary water, non-detect. And well water, of course, non-detect. So this was extremely good for Salmonella. For Cyclospora, non-detect in everything, not even in the incoming effluent. E. coli 0157H7, non-detect in everything. Legionella, same, non-detect. Giardia, well, Giardia is present almost everywhere nowadays. In raw wastewater, it occurred from 2,000 to 22,000 per liter. In secondary effluent, 0.4 to 12. In disinfected tertiary, non-detect to 0.09, and in well water, non-detect. To put the Giardia in context, let's look at recycled water in Monterrey, recycled water in St. Pete, Florida, in groundwaters, in surface water, and drinking waters. As you see, the percent positive is similar to other waters, and the range is non-detect basically to a small number in all the waters. In fact, for recycled water, it's less than even surface waters. Cryptosporidium, non-detect. Fecal coliform, very high reduction in the disinfected tertiary, so that it's non-detect by the time you get to disinfected tertiary. But secondary effluent still contains quite a bit of fecal coliform, which is an indicator of possible pathogenic organisms. Now let's talk about microorganisms of emerging concern, CECs. There's a lot of talk about these. Where do they come from? They come from pharmaceuticals primarily, prescription drugs, over-the-counter drugs such as aspirin, ibuprofen, and even coffee, and illicit drugs, endocrine disruptors, estrogen, dioxin, estrogen-mimicking compounds, personal care products, fragrances, lotions, sunscreens, cleaning products. There's the ability to detect now is at extremely low concentrations. We have improved our ability to detect these chemicals, these organic compounds. But the relevance to human health, is it at the part per million level? Is it at the part per billion, part per trillion, part per quintillion? This is something that is a subject of much research and study nowadays, and I'll give you some of the results as we still have a few minutes of time. Chemicals of emerging concern. As I said, they are at very, very low concentrations, but our detection ability has increased. In the 1960s, we could detect at 1 milligram per liter range, and that was our detection limit. The 1980s, 1 microgram per liter. 2020, 1 nanogram per liter. By 2040, we'll be able to do 1 picogram per liter. By the year 2080, we should be able to get even the existence of 1 molecule per liter. Imagine that. So as this ability to detect extremely low concentrations of chemicals increases, does that mean that we are at more risk? I don't think so. The significance is very important to bear in mind to human health and to the environment. The Water Use Research Foundation is engaged in researching recycled water to see how safe it is. And to do that, they have reviewed many, many publications and research results from various countries. And these are some of the results that they have found. For example, how much does it take? How many years of exposure does it take to get 1 safe dose of ibuprofen from being exposed to recycled water? If you are an agricultural worker, you have to work in agriculture for 28,000 years in order to get 1 safe dose of ibuprofen from your agricultural work. If you are a landscaper, it takes you 8,600 years to get that 1 dose. If you are a child playing on the playground that is irrigated with recycled water, it takes 67,000 years of that play. Would that child live 67,000 years? If you are a golfer, it takes 26,000 years. Golfers don't live as long. Recycled water exposure scenario for 17 beta estradiol, which is a human replacement compound. For agricultural workers, 16,000 years of exposure, 5,000 years for landscaper, 660,000 years for the child, and 13,000 years for the golfer. Same scenario, more or less, for other compounds. Here's fluoxetine, an antidepressant that's commonly prescribed. And as you see, the years of exposure are extremely high. Here's an antibiotic that's prescribed for urinary infection and sinusitis. Again, very high number of years of exposure to get one safe dose. DEET. DEET is a compound that's used as you go hiking in order to repel insects. Look at the millions of years it takes to get one safe dose, such as you apply to yourself in order to go hiking. Carbamazepine is an epileptic seizure drug that is prescribed for seizures. And there was an Israeli paper published recently in ESNT as a proof of concept. They looked at 17 people who ate vegetables irrigated with recycled water, and they looked at their urine samples, and they found that, sure, a very small concentration of carbamazepine was in their urine samples. But we calculated that if you eat nothing but vegetables, as a vegan person who only eats vegetable, it takes you 200 years of eating that produce in order to get one safe therapeutic dose of carbamazepine in your system. And if you're not a vegetarian, it will take you 2,000 years to get to that ADI, allowable daily intake. So based on all these numbers of years, I think we can conclude that CECs, constituents of emerging concern, are not a safety hazard for people. The research results tell us that treatment level is fit for the intended use, and there's no significant difference with well water or other sources of water for use in agriculture. Worker exposure to water is not a problem. Constituents of emerging concern are extremely low concentration, and it takes thousands, if not millions, of years of exposure before the safe dose is reached. Soil infiltration rate is not affected. Acceptance of produce by wholesale buyers and public acceptance have been assured. There are additional benefits using recycled water. It increases the community's water supply and its reliability over the long term. It preserves the community's quality of life, maintenance of local jobs and tax base, reduction in energy demand. The energy demand for recycled water is anywhere from 1/3 to 1/10 that of seawater desalination, depending on what method you use. And of course, reduction in carbon footprint. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I think we've got time for questions. Elaine?
Hi, Bahman. I don't know if you can go to the bottom to the QA option and you can read the questions. At the bottom, you have the QA
Okay.
button. You can push there and then you have 8 questions. So you can go, you can read them and answer one by one. Did you find it?
I am looking for it right now.
Should be down at the bottom, the
yes,
QA
at the bottom
option.
of your screen.
You don't have a QA like option next to participants.
Okay, I should stop share then,
Okay.
right?
Okay, yeah, sure.
Okay, now I see it. Okay, now I see it, yes. All right, the first question is, with all due respect for dead people, what is the rationale behind the fact that regulations for irrigation of cemeteries and playgrounds are the same? The answer is that, at least in the United States, relatives of deceased people tend to go to cemeteries and even have picnics near the grave of their dearly departed individual. And so, and also, they have green flowers and they need to water those flowers and keep them alive. And sometimes they might mistakenly drink from the source of water that they use for drinking, for watering the flowers. As a result, they require the highest quality water be used for irrigation of cemeteries. It's not to protect the dead people.
Interesting.
The next question, Mr. Carlos Rivas asks, do you think that pandemic could mean more warnings, more prevention of for recycled water for irrigation, more requirement for disinfection? Actually, the Water Environment Federation has just published a paper that shows that coronavirus pandemic or the agents for the coronavirus pandemic are stopped with disinfection processes that are used in producing recycled water. So unless there is a scare that is illogical, there is no scientific reason to doubt that recycled water is safe from the perspective of coronavirus. Ruben asks, what are the most important studies related to the interaction among soil, crops, and regenerated water? Actually, there are very many. There are probably hundreds of such studies. And I'll be glad to send you a bibliography if you send me an email with your email address. And we've got many such studies. Of course, I think that my study in the 1980s in Monterrey is one of the first and still one of the most extensive such study, but there have been many, many others since then. Next question. How important is SAR, sodium absorption ratio, for irrigation water? Is it different for large crops as cereals and produce as vegetables? It seems not to be a big issue when using natural surface waters like rivers and lakes. Okay, there are several questions in here. First of all, natural surface waters like rivers and lakes normally do not have the amount of sodium in them that recycled water does. Recycled water, since it's used water, as we use the water, we add salts to it, and salts include sodium, and that causes the higher SAR, sodium absorption ratio, in the irrigation water that could cause problems primarily with the soil, not so much with the plants, but it could cause problems with soil permeability as a result of destroying the structure of the soil and making the soil less permeable, less infiltration rate. So again, there have been several studies on this question, and right now there is another big research study initiated by the Water Research Foundation to look into the criteria that we use to measure the impact of SAR by coming up with other measures of sodicity and its impact on the soil. Sodium by itself at very high concentration can also have what they call specific ion effect on some crops. And most recycled waters do not have enough sodium to reach that level, at least from my reading of the research in this area. So I hope that answers your question. Ruben asks this question: besides paper 47, which other works analyze dangers related to the use of reclaimed water in agriculture, considering soil crop interactions? Again, as I said, there are many, many research papers on impacts of the use of recycled water on soils and crops. And I could send you a list. It's hard for me off the top of my head to list all of them. Another question. Please ask only the second question, disregard the first one. Oh, I don't know what that Oh, I see. Okay, I've already been through those, so I've already answered both. Carlos Rivas asks this question: can a high dose of residual chlorine applied for disinfection affect crops? Yes. Yes, the answer is yes. Anything more than a 0.5 milligram per liter of residual chlorine could possibly cause leaf tip burn. We have actually studied various doses applied to crops with sprinkler irrigation. And sprinkler irrigation, of course, is the only way that you can impact that. If you apply water below the surface or at the surface of the soil, the residual chlorine dissipates very quickly and doesn't affect the plant. But if it is applied with sprinkler and it has more than 0.5 milligram per liter, it could cause burning of the leaf tips. Great question. Also, Carlos asks, which do you suggest to guarantee Giardia removal being resistant to chlorine disinfection? Well, Giardia is large enough that can be removed by fine sand filtration. And of course, chlorine is not as effective on Giardia as it is on crypto and other parasites. But if you have a good fine sand filter, it will take it out. And that was our experience in Monterrey. We got to extremely low concentrations and even non-detect. Another question. Regarding the CECs, does your opinion change in the case of reuse of drinking water for drinking water purposes? Question mark. I agree that the golf player doesn't run much risk playing golf on the course irrigated by reused water, but that panorama changes in case of drinking. Well, in the case of drinking water, we don't stop at disinfected tertiary treatment. We go beyond that. We go to the level of reverse osmosis and advanced oxidation with ozone and peroxide. And that level of treatment definitely removes CECs to non-detect levels. And there are many, many research papers that have actually looked into this because of the upcoming California regulations for drinking water use of recycled water treated at higher levels. So good question, but the treatment level is different. Next question is from Ruben, who wants to know, how can I find all the information related to the Monterrey field research? Well, send me an email and I will send you at least one, maybe two papers that we published on the Monterrey research project. Laura Carvera asks, are the technologies and infrastructure necessary to implement the disinfection tertiary financed by the government? What was the protocol for implementation? The pilot project that I mentioned over the 5-year period, that was almost entirely funded by the US government and some state government funding, with a little bit of funding from locals, but mostly federal funding. However, the ongoing use of disinfection and treatment technologies for producing tertiary recycled water are funded by the local agencies that produce the recycled water. Next question from Wilson Robles.
Okay, Bahman, I'm going to translate it for you. So if my country doesn't have a regulation about water reuse for agriculture, so which regulation can I use as a reference?
World Health Organization would be your best bet. Of course, I'm kind of prejudiced about California regulation Title 22, but I think in some cases it goes too far. I think World Health Organization guidelines are the best to emulate.
Bahman, can you send us a link where we can get that regulation so we can share it with all the Aladyr members?
Let me make a note. I'll do that.
We will do that. Thank you.
Okay.
So Wilson, I'm going to translate the answer to Wilson, Bahman. Wilson, él recomienda utilizar la normativa del World Health Organization y nosotros vamos a publicar un link donde puedes conseguir la normativa. Go ahead, Bahman.
Okay. In your opinion, why in countries such as Peru, where the stress by water is heavy, farmers don't use recycled water? What will be your suggestion in order to improve that situation? What will be the better way to cost allocation between water operator and farmers? Again, there are several questions here. One of the main reasons farmers don't use recycled water in countries such as Peru is institutional issues. The organization that produces or that treats wastewater sewage has usually no interest in doing anything else, such as providing water. Water production is not their responsibility, somebody else's responsibility. So it takes a champion for the farmers or for the water industry as a whole to come forward and say, we need this resource to be developed in the first place. We need to get to the right level of treatment. We need to get the pipelines, the conveyance systems to get the water from where it is produced to the farmers to be used. This was the difficulty we had in Monterrey. In the 1970s, when it was produced, there was no treatment, there was no conveyance system, and the farmers were really desperate for another source of water because, as I said, the seawater intrusion was spoiling their source of water, and they had to abandon their wells and some of their farms. But it took some champions in the area to take on the cause and essentially bring in resources, monetary resources from the federal government to do this study, to convince people that it was safe, and to also build the infrastructure for treatment and conveyance to get the water to the farmers. That was the reason there, and I think that's the case in many other places too. These institutional problems need to be solved, and it takes a champion to do it. So that's my suggestion. What will be the better way to cost allocation between the water operator and the farmer? That's another good question. The farmer cannot afford the cost of treatment and distribution of recycled water. That is a societal cost that needs to be borne by the state, by the federal government, because water is important, food is important for the community, for the society, and the farmer cannot be burdened with those costs. Otherwise, it will never happen. So in order to produce the water, there needs to be the willpower at the federal level to build the infrastructure to do it. I hope that answers the question. I just don't know another way to make it possible without having societal intervention. It's good for the whole country to have the ability of the farmer to grow, to continue to be able to grow and provide cheap food for everyone. Ruben, thank you very much for your thanks. You're welcome. Laura Cabrera says, do you know about studies for using recycled water in hydroponics? I'm thinking if the composition of recycled water could affect the chemical balance needed to feed the plants. Hydroponics is a very intensive agricultural operation, and its water use actually is not that tremendous, that great. And also, when hydroponics are used, the chemical balance, as you said, is very important to provide the nutrients while not increasing the salt level so as to affect the yield of the plants. So it would be a complicated thing to bring in recycled water to a hydroponics operation, which may not need that much water to begin with. I don't think it's the best application for it, even though I'm an advocate for recycled water for almost all uses. I think this is one where the complications might be more than enough to make it a feasible thing to do. Okay, one last question. No, that's not a question. Okay, that's it.
So, Bahman, on behalf of Aladyr, thank you very much for your presentation and time. It was really good and really interesting, all the topic. So if we receive any question, after your webinar, we will send it to you by email. Thank you very much and have a great week. And thank you for all the assistance.
Thank you, Juan Miguel. I sure appreciate you inviting me to do this. I enjoyed doing it. Thank you.
Bye, guys. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, Mr. Bahman. Thank you. Gracias a todos nuestros asistentes. Esperamos poder contar con ustedes en nuestros próximos webinars. Recuerden visitar nuestras redes para que puedan verificar el calendario y con mucho gusto les estaremos recibiendo. Feliz tarde. Bye, Mr. Bahman. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.